Good afternoon. Welcome to Dark Comedy to Black Mirror. Today I want to just walk through a couple ideas and thoughts with you in this exciting course and have you think a little bit more about the nature of comedy and what it offers us. So I'm going to start here with, if you're on our course site, something that we should all just think about maybe as some background ideas as a preface to humor. And it's been said that dark humor or dark comedy is like food. Not everybody gets it. And maybe that's a way for us to think into the next idea, which is, well, what exactly makes something funny? And where's the line between tragedy and comedy? Often, for example, we know that humor or laughter is masking some very deep human emotions. And at the same time, we could say, well, not every joke translates well. What makes something funny to one group of people is not considered humorous to another. So it's worthwhile to say that comedy and humor itself are subjective. Even so, what's interesting is to start thinking about how almost every genre, tragedy, comedy, makes use of multiple sort of genres. So, for example, if you think about a Shakespeare play, a Shakespeare tragedy, you'll find that even a play like Hamlet has interruptions of silliness, exchanges between somebody like, let's say, Polonius and Hamlet. And Polonius goes on and on with his speeches. And as watchers of this play, we could ask this kind of question of, well, why is this silliness in a play that's essentially about whether Hamlet should avenge the death of his father? More recently, the question has been so ingrained in our culture that NPR describes a new genre called traumedies that describe the kind of line between tragedies and comedies. And so if you've looked at more recent kind of things that are offered on maybe Hulu or Netflix, you might have seen things something like Afterlife, right? Or Dead to Me. These are good examples of it. And if we look at just what humor does, we could think about, well, on one hand, humor can just focus for most people as a diversion from sorrow. It's a respite from the toil of things upon us. So right now, for example, we're all suffering from the effects of COVID. And maybe the jokes that come about, the song parodies, I've written a couple of them, are not funny per se. There's nothing humorous about people dying or a pandemic. On the other hand, what do we do with the endless parade of suffering? The ongoing sense that we can't get any respite from things. So we might say that jokes function as a way to be a release valve, in much the same way that Stephen King has said that horror films are a way of human catharsis. That he says, we are dark people, we are monsters underneath. And he says we have to let the monsters out to walk around. So Stephen King thinks that we like to look at the dark side of life, see suffering, and then we can go back and live normal lives. And what Stephen King has said that I think is true of comedy as well is that we are socialized into being, let's say, quote unquote, good people. You don't make dead baby jokes, right? Unless you're in maybe Future Man in a Hulu season. You can watch something like that, and it's not funny to some people. So this idea, though, is that maybe comedy functions in the same way. It's a way for us to cope with the unspeakable. And an example that comes to mind for me is in a Kurt Vonnegut story where, and in many Kurt Vonnegut stories, they're not optimistic about human nature's ability to get us to anywhere good in the future. There's been a nuclear war, and a father and son look out at the waste and the wreckage, and there's bodies on the beach. It looks like something out of the medieval Black Death. And the father puts his arm around his son and kind of chides him, trying to get him into better spirits. And he says, cheer up. Someday all this will be yours. Wow. So we could say humor is a way of coping, it's diversionary, it can be trite, it can just be simply what gets us through and helps us to endure and go on. Uh, it could also, we could say, humor is there to make us feel uneasy and not to solve problems, but to make us more aware. If you've ever seen a film that came out in the 1960s called Dr. Strangelove, it was written during the American Cold War policy. And at least what you need to know about it is to say this is a time period where Americans were in a deadly race with the Soviets. There were nuclear arms built up, and everybody lived under this kind of fear and tension that we would be destroyed. And this is a tension and fear that went on well through the 1980s with Ronald Reagan's Star Wars sort of plan. And the sense in this film, which is just strange and absurd, you have to watch it to get it, is, well, that it vents the acknowledgement that Americans were really afraid for whatever was underneath the patriotic flag waving, that we would be annihilated or the Russians would come and get us. And the whole kind of acronym that came up was mutually assured destruction, or MAD. So a film like that is a way to present what's going on without offering us any neat corrective social solutions. And if we think about just other kinds of films or other kinds of areas in this genre, maybe you're familiar with the old Twilight Zone series, in which very cleverly, we were showed by Sterling this idea that, maybe there's more underneath the surface of these nice people who live in the suburbs. Maybe the monsters who are due on Maple Street are people that we have to look for. They're not aliens. They're not in the 1950s paranoia, Soviet spies looking around. There are friends and neighbors who are fear-ridden. And once they start looking for monsters, discover their own monstrous natures. And that tends to be the point of a lot of what's underneath Twilight Zone's kind of series. So we can look at this as a way of saying in a very precautionary way, be careful about the nature of fear, hysteria, and conspiracy theories. Not that we have them going on right now, right? So we could look deeper into that and say there's a reflection of the 1950s McCarthy trials, where notable writers, filmmakers were rounded up and accused of being leftist, un-Americans, and because they were considered un-American, jailed and forced to name others. They were forced to try to find and sort out other sort of people who were considered also leftist. So the way that we have in a Bradbury story or a Twilight Zone episode of looking in the mirror is a way of saying, in another sense, well, look at our own selves and look at what we've become and look at, how even, let's say, being normal is something to fear maybe than the person who's unknown. So the Twilight Zone does this brilliantly. And one kind of example, if you look at an episode called Mirror, Mirror, it's, to me, underneath the surface is, if you have any kind of strange ideas, you better keep them to yourself, because if you don't, the cops will show up because some well-meaning citizen will report you for being eccentric or crazy, as it was said at that time, and take you off to the loony bin. All right, so we have definitely the sense that comedy or humor or dark mirror kinds of episodes are ways of making us think more deeply about ourselves. But what about other humorous conventions? Well, a notable one is satire. And satire uses wit, it uses irony, and it's a way of getting us to think a little bit more about what's beneath the surface of our own actions. Should we look more fully at what we're doing and be agents of change? So a famous example that you're probably familiar with is A Modest Proposal, which was written by Jonathan Swift. It's a late 18th century essay, and it addresses very frankly the way that the Irish people had been reduced to starvation and want because of the policies of inhumane practices on behalf of the British. So his proposal that, well, the English gentry should be able to have these year-old children, Irish children who've been raised as livestock, and devour these children. Well, that's really appropriate because, well, after all, the English have already devoured the parents. So, of course, what we see Swift doing is using this metaphor of devouring as a way to show and to shock people into the brutality of the way these actions were hurting people. And this idea of a policy, or well, let's create a policy and think about the greatest good for the greatest number. But in so doing, leave out humanity. And so for Swift, that's incomprehensible. So satire is a form that addresses this idea of humor, but it's also in a very dark sort of way, right? The intention in this particular genre, unlike just humor, puns, wit, and diversionary things, is to inspire change. So that's a key difference. Then we might have another form that I'm sure you're familiar with called confessional forms, dramatic monologues. If you've read Poe's The Telltale Heart, you'll know that the narrator of the story is always confessing things that he's basically trying to hide right under this veneer. And it becomes apparent that he can no longer hold back the truth. So there's a sense in which a lot of genres do this. If you're familiar with David Sedaris, right, his way of getting at his own kind of humor and his own pain is to show you how he himself is the object of ridicule. So dramatic monologues can do a couple different things. Generally, they're about the audience seeing something that the speaker or the narrator is unaware of. A good example of this, maybe a better one than the Sedaris example, is the British series called Fleabag, in which the young woman who calls herself Fleabag reveals herself loathing. It's very comical. The situations with her family are funny. Everybody is dysfunctional. And she's constantly just hooking up randomly with people. But there's a level where she has some self-knowledge, she's pushing away this knowledge, and then we as viewers are painfully brought into, oh, what is she hiding under this pain? What do these flippancy sort of, coping devices, what do they do, right? I mean, how do they hide her dark guilt and profound sadness? And at times, of course, the sadness bubbles over and she's not effective in keeping it down. So there's a way in which there's comedy, but there's also tragedy under the surface. So we're back to seeing both of these things together. Well, then there's a few kind of ways that we might just say, what then do we do to dig deeper into any kind of work and look at humor itself? And if you just go back to the site here, you'll notice there's a lot of questions to ask. And I'm not going to go through this list, but I'll just point out, start with, what do you think the work is actually about? Or what do you think it's trying to get us to think about or challenge? And then you might think about how it uses humor to accomplish this idea or objective or questions, because it's not algebra. The work is not going to tell us exactly what to think. It's more interested, I think, or authors are, artists are, in just having us think about the age-old human questions that we can't resolve. So have a look at this list and think about what the humor is doing. Have a look at Bakhtín's theory and ask yourself if, when you watch something, if in that series, in that dramatic work, is everything resolved or put back together in the same way that it started? Is it business as usual, or is there disruption to the established order? Those are things to look for. As you scroll through, you'll also notice that we'll be looking at some what I'd call weird science fiction. And we'll be looking at the dystopia and utopian worlds as ways of mirroring, quite literally, the problems, contemporary issues of a time that still reflect issues of gender, issues of culture, and technology today. So we'll see some gender bending in Gilman's work, If I Were a Man. We'll look at futuristic worlds shaped by technology. So if you're a Black Mirror fan, you'll know that a lot of the kind of questions about AI, artificial intelligence, and technology are not just theoretical anymore. They're also about, well, who gets to use this power? Should we use technologies just because we have one? And so I've included some pictures in here. And if you just follow through here, we're back to also thinking about technology, Frankenstein myths, and how these resonate with us today. We can go back to Mary Shelley's work, which was written over 200 years ago, and think about some of these same kind of questions. And then we can get finally to this idea back to Black Mirror and the conventions. So I'll just end with a sort of spoiler. In a Ray Bradbury story, a father takes his son to a distant land, so to speak, and the son keeps asking him while they're on this picnic, when am I going to see the Martians? When am I going to see the Martians? And finally the father says, just wait, we'll see them. And by the end of the story, the father tells the kids to gather around, and they go near a river, and they look into the river. And then the father says, look into the river, and you'll see the Martians. I hope you enjoyed this class and have a great day. I'll see you online soon.